Do you remember when the world was young? She scoffed, heels clacking as she made her way out of the elevator. Dear grandson. Her body rippled as the illusion of the doctor faded like water, black scales glistening under the fluorescence. Bring the other blades to the altar so we can finish this. Modek nodded beside her, sheathing Aru's dagger and sprinting down one of the grand holes with his cloak flying. She walked on, scaled feet still clacking, and hissed in her throat with a smile, muscled tail swimming behind as she passed through the red oak halls and grand windows, over the marbled floor, under the glistening chandeliers. I remember the world before this one, she thought, and the one before that, and the one before that. I remember my firstborns, however long ago that was. There were 7 of them, and each was worse than the last. They tried to fight me, and 4 died. They tried to carve me up and turn my bones into fence and foundation, my blood into oceans and sea, my breath into wind and storm. They didn't hold their world long. Her white eyes caught a nurse, a woman in blue scrubs pushing a dolly of unopened boxes. See to it, Eru and Iradu are restrained. They can't stop me as Adama. The nurse stopped and bowed. Right away, mistress. And send someone to clean up Aru's mess in the office. It's likely cinders, she said in passing, crocodilian snout upturning as she inhaled and smiled. Right away, mistress. Iradu and Aru, she thought, and their faces flared behind her white eyes. The evening sun beside the dark earth and sea. They morphed into a pair they'd never known, ancient twins, and she smirked, walking from the hall to a vaulted foyer. A stone table sat in the middle, chipped and worn from millennia in the Syrian winds and wars. A crystal chandelier sat unlit, twinkling in the sunlight from the wall of French doors to her right. Her eyes hovered over the few reliefs still visible on the edge of the altar. Tiamat's battle with Marduk. That second litter was slyer. They ran rather than fight. Her clawed fingers trailed the battered reliefs, scratching new indents as she passed it for the wall of doors. She crossed the threshold and took in the fresh air. Head tilted back as she spread her arms and grew, 9 feet, 12, 2 stories, and walked from the limestone steps to the slate rock path, cutting through the court's green manicured lawn. It took eons to find them. I'd thought they hadn't changed anything, but they'd taken the ether above me and molded it. One had fashioned a realm of ice, the other of flame, and between them became water and earth. They'd hoisted it all up on the backs of their children's corpses in hopes I wouldn't notice. She looked up at the sun and scowled with a sigh before thinking. It was impressive, the lengths they were willing to go to keep from my wrath. They called their world beautiful. I called it abomination. They were soon consumed to writhe in my bowels. She followed the slate path to the center of the court, where 3 others branched out cardinally, to arches and pavilions. The cross-section was a circle of slate with limestone obelisks either side each path, where they met. 4 stone beams rose from the turf and met at the center of the slate circle like the skeleton of a pyramid, polished onyx capstone gleaming in the sun above a long block of stone. She crossed between the obelisks and smiled at Modek as he breached the doors of the courtyard opposite her. He saw her and smiled, his form growing to match her own, hair aglow in the sunlight until it caught in rainbow flame. His eyes flashed white, orange, blue, and gold, skin blackening around them and his mouth. Heat danced before his clothes caught fire and fell from ashen skin, freckles gleaming like embers, and he walked to her bare and shameless. His feet and hands blackened, smoke rising from his lips and nostrils as he spoke, setting a waxen canvas parcel on the slab. Mistress Temat. He unrolled the cloth, and 3 daggers winked. Stygian blades drinking the sunlight, bone handles glowing above, each with a different pommel. Aru's was white, Eradu's was ruby, and Earu's was transparent gold like frozen honey. Finally, 3 daggers, she thought. My 3rd brood was the queerest. I only had one, a quiet creature that remained in my womb and never spoke to me, never cursed nor blessed. We were almost at peace, and I thought we'd exist that way forever. I without and he within, silent and eternal. I'd been wrong. She glared at the daggers, tiny for her true size, claws hovering over them like another set of blades. He'd built within me. He'd walked within me. He'd found the others before him that had run in defiance of my will, and those who never breached my hide. He didn't speak. He didn't incite wrath or vengeance or war. He didn't have to. He cared for them, lifted them onto their feet, strengthened them. He was strong, but never used his strength. He was sharp-eyed, but never looked for exit. He was kind. And kindness was a weapon I hadn't considered before. It's done, mistress. She looked up and smiled. Yes. Where did you get the materials? Her claws traced the block of stone as she sniffed the air above. It smells of the sun. Modek smiled, teeth like diamonds as his voice cracked on the air. The princes of the underworld have long held my trust from the time of Aru's reign. They let me take the Stygian iron without question. From the belly of the earth, eh? Well, those eons ago, after the ministrations of my silent rebel, the others were strengthened as he was as well. They not only stood, but consumed. They took my belly and harvested it, drinking and eating me for strength. They needn't have cleaved me open for freedom. No, only hollow me out, to leave nothing but bone. And the bone? She stopped and licked the handle, closing her eyes and seeing Eradu's glowing face, snarling in defense of his beloved. She set the blade back with its siblings and found Modek's smirk. Arya won't need her left arm after we've ruined this world. She hissed a laugh and cupped his face. Beloved grandson, how you've pleased me. I hope to please you more with the world I make, to rule those who would stand against you. He drifted to the blades and chuckled. Honestly, I'm surprised you remember the scent of Earu's mutt. Her smile wavered as the hound of living flame snarled and snapped at her, eyes like Earu's, fangs sharp as hers, breath hot as hers. She gently rubbed her throat, ignoring the heat from the sun at her back. My memory is hers. Her eyes glided over the blades, scowling at the light playing in their gems. I'll not forget the taste of his blood, nor the sting of his tooth. I'll forget none who wrong me. Vengeance will be mine, always, she thought. All that time ago, the blood and flesh my unborn multitudes had taken, even without my understanding, gave them my wrath and vengeance then. For we are not simply one thing or more. We are the sum of all our parts, and our parts, well, they're also their own. So when they took of my flesh, they took in me. I roused those parts from slumber. I let them assume forms all their own. My vengeance was given by things that were me, and things that were not me, simultaneously. My waking flesh. These rebellious 3 call them shades, call me a shade. But I'm as much their mother as I am not, just as they're as much me as they are not. She smirked as the knives glinted under her clawed touch, their heat and cold radiating like afterglow through her scales. Later, the feasts of my unborn proved very beneficial to me. All that darkness they consumed tainted them, made for good defense in my stomach against the abstaining few. The shades, as they're called, couldn't harvest all of them, but they did stop my butchery. Then all I had to do was birth them and introduce myself. All my parts as well with them. My shades held them down as I burned them, or they ripped them to pieces and threw them into my mouth. Or with the one. Him I saved for last, so he could watch, feel the heat of my flames, hear the screams of everyone he'd tried to help. He'd wanted to ruin my appetite when I finally faced him. He looked me in the eyes and spoke for the first and final time. "Good," he'd said. "You repay with evil, so evil will never leave you, and shall feast on you within and without." Then I set my shades on him. He was quartered and chopped into pieces before they threw him into my belly. The funny thing was, a shade had fallen in love with him and helped him in my womb. I don't understand how. She was me. She was my mind and soul and flesh, but she loved him, and so she had to be punished. I called her forward to destroy her, to swallow her with my greatest flame, but she discerned it and flew down my throat before I could kill her. Modek took her hands, drawing her eye as he smiled. "Grandmother, soon the world will be as you wish to make it." She grinned and tightened her grip. "And you shall rule as king, finally." His eyes flared, skin graying as his hands blackened and cracked, lips splitting in a sparking smile. "Does it bother you?" "I will rule. It matters not whether it be in your belly or on your back." She chuckled and leaned over the table, pressing her lips against his scolding forehead before setting her claws there. She traced it lightly, cutting the skin until her name bled in the ancient tongue, barely remembered by even her. "Then I mark you. I have given no one my name save you. You aren't my firstborn, nor shall you be my last, but you are of me, and shall be liken me unto the end." "Tu shipnif na gevgasetos hortig," he repeated in the ancient tongue. "You speak it well," she smiled, white eyes falling on the bleeding symbols in his flesh, steaming and hissing in the cool air. "As for that shade, whether she lived or not is beyond even me. She cloaked herself from me somehow, and my gut is not small. There are worlds within enough to house her could she withstand them. Yet I felt nothing afore these three rebels carved themselves free. But Modek tells of others who fled my belly for the halls of this world, one like a corpse, and sewn together in tatters with a winged wife of light. But she's of light. That couldn't be her, I think." Modek smiled, skin bristling as golden ichor trickled down his face, falling onto his lithe chest. "You honor me greatly, mistress. I shall not disappoint." "No," she said. "Now let us open the first door. Have you sent for my sisters?" He nodded. Timtet has taken her host to the east, and Temat the west. The way should be clear soon. "And the cloaks?" "Complete. They'll look nothing more than spirits of the underworld once they pass the gates. No one should bother them, and then it's just going through the labyrinth." She smiled and stepped back to face the eastern doors, voice filling the air despite never raising. "Bring the stallions." Her sisters bowed in the doors, anthropomorphic creatures with grey and ashen skin and 4 silver eyes above tusked mouths. They trotted through the halls on crooked legs, black gowns billowing around them from bone pins at their shoulders. "The keys," she said, walking over the eastern obelisk and touching the forgotten hieroglyphs in the stone, which no Adam could read. "You never said how you got them. I couldn't even find them." "I was Aru's friend for many eons. I helped build the walls and foundations of their world. I am one who knows many things, and has come to earn the trust of Aru and Aradu from my time below." She smirked, following the glyphs from top to bottom as they foretold the destruction of all. "Yes, you're the punishing fire, bringer of terror and tempest." She looked over her shoulder as he approached, picking up one of the Stygian blades. They were entrusted not to the underworld, but the edges of all, distanced from god and man alike. He admired the red stone, lighting a small fire in one open palm to admire the prisms. Their guards were old and considered me friend long ago. It made it easier to slip by and kill them. "You betray your friends so easily." He looked up and found her white gaze. "I betray no friend. I said they considered me friend, but we were not. I lied to them." He joined her at the twin obelisk, looking the glyphs over, his face unchanging and serious. "To live a life as mine, you must have all call you friend and hold few dear and true. Friends have loose lips and strong hands, and I've profited from both." "From my sisters?" She faced him and stepped closer, slipping the blade from his grip as the flame died in his palm. He furrowed his brow as she turned and returned the dagger, her sisters coming with 2 white stallions. "Mistress, I didn't betray them, nor you." "I know, grandson." She smiled over her shoulder, beckoning her sisters closer. "Fear not, especially me. I do not betray my friends either. Nor do I revoke the gifts of my name," she thought. "Not lightly." Her sisters arrived, small as birds before her. She petted one stallion, cooing it as her fingers laced around its neck and drug it forward. It whinnied and reared. She yanked it to her side and cast it to the floor between the eastern obelisk. It thrashed and called for help. "Hold the other!" Modek grabbed the other stallion's mane as her sisters stepped aside. She reared back and unhinged her jaw, falling on the stallion and crunching his ribs in her maw. It screamed, thrashing as she tore back and brought bone, viscera, and flesh with her. She swallowed, returning to him and plunging her hands inside, stretching the crater as mortal blood sprayed with the horse's wails. He kicked at her, head up and snapping as his hooves found her knee. She crushed his foot in her hand, clawed his flank, ripping his leg free with howls of pain as the flesh and sinew stretched and snapped, blood bathing the slate in ruby, splattering his white coat, dripping off her hands and chin. She swung the leg into the grass without looking away, blood arcing off her arm and splattering the altar. She smiled and plunged her hands into the bowels, stringing them out until every scale on her arms was drenched. Rising from the ground, she smeared the white marble obelisks, caressing the glyphs, chanting under her breath until it climbed to a shout. "Osh Khalif Kedoro, Obejbeh Rochot Nemhortu," she commanded in the ancient tongue. "Nem keru neh shafa'a ocha, kan love tigovoshka dematik." The air groaned, rippling as wind blew at her back through the obelisks, faster and faster until a gale drug the dying horse's blood between them. The space before her folded on itself, groaning like strained iron. She repeated the incantation and plunged her hand into the stallion's chest, ripping out his heart. She held it over her head and squeezed, letting it rain red over black scales. "Modek, come!" He touched her shoulder and she turned, holding the dripping heart over his face. He closed his eyes and the blood boiled on his skin, blackening, rolling off his dried ichor like water on wax until gold shone through the crimson. He smiled and licked his lips, face black with mortal blood, eyes blazing, streaks of crimson rolling down his slender trunk. She held the heart to his lips, repeating the chant and adding to the end. O ursetos hecha, negevgasiti nat stosh. He repeated her words, willing them true, to be united for eternity, and took the heart between his teeth. The flesh boiled, popping and screaming as he chewed, smoke billowing from his lips, flaming hair spinning and whirling like a dancer. He swallowed, and she ate the rest, turning to the obelisk as he knelt before the dead husk of a stallion and bloodied his own hands. "Nemkeru!" She commanded it open, setting one palm on the ground before the obelisk as Modek smeared the blood across the other obelisk. "Nemkeru!" He knelt, hand planted like her own. The air folded and creased, screaming and whining until the world warped and twisted between the spires of stone and tore away with ghostly edges like shredded flesh in water. She stood and smiled, stepping over the carcass and through the door into the grim dark of the eastern labyrinth. "What of the west?" "We've only the one set of keys," she said, chuckling as she set a bloody hand on the wall, old, grey, rough, hungry. "We'll open the west once the east is ours. Besides," she looked over her shoulder as Modek stepped through, "even with one bane open, we'll claim this world easily enough." She looked back at the wall as one of his sisters approached and bowed to Modek, the stone twinkling with his flaming hair and eyes. She slipped the concealed daggers into her satchel and lifted it to him, backing out of the door after he took it and thanked her. Temat took a wide stance, opening her mouth as smoke rose from her throat. White flame exploded, booming against the walls and ceiling as they swallowed the rocks and turned it to molten pools. And the next wall, and the next, until 7 had fallen like candles in the hearth. "Eternity is long, and these rebellions have always risen and fallen, but I am the dragon of old. I am eternal, and none shall surpass me." She stepped over the mounded ruin and took another wide stance before the next standing wall, inhaling and vomiting a column of fire. "I am mother and destroyer." She crossed the next ruin and vomited fire again. "I am flame and darkness." And again. "I am hunger and gluttony." And again. "I am neither life nor death." And once more. "I am absence." Modek tapped her shoulder as she panted, spittle dripping from between her fangs. He gestured to the next wall. "May I?" She smirked and waved him forward, catching her breath. "I can't have all the glory, can I?" "Certainly not, mistress." He stood at the melted ruin before his target, hands forward like he were pushing off the floor. A candle flame leapt to life, then swelled into an orb, a globe big as he, flames churning within and without. Lightning pulsed under his skin as he breathed, smoke rising from his fingers as he slowly exhaled. The sphere opened, and the flames fell like water, gushing over the floor and splashing against the wall, roaring, spilling from his hands and rushing, searching, devouring the stone, and washing over it to the next wall, and the next, and the next. Light filled the labyrinth on the backs of great roars and screams as guardian beasts fled or were ensnared by Modek's hunting flame. The ceiling of the cave sparkled like the night sky as it had been before Adamar built their steel cities. The labyrinth trembled and quaked and groaned at his touch. Her grin fell, white eyes glued to his ashen back and flaming crown. His stance, his gait, his hands, his light. He truly is Eru's son. She frowned, and he transformed. Gone was the world for a single blink, replaced by the black oblivion and Eru, his light, his fire, as she trembled and groaned before he carved himself free. When he next breathed, he held up his palms and the flames slowed, then stopped, reversing and swimming back into their master's veins. The lightning under his skin faded, the light in his hands became a humble torch, and he turned, smiling his diamond smile, and gesturing through the miles of open ruin and molten stone, Modek once more. "There's something to be said of order, grandmother," he panted, sweat steaming off his bloodied face, "at least regarding our flame." She forced a smile and walked past him, admiring the churning red glow. "Indeed, this will make our journey far faster." She turned and kissed his scorching cheek. "Thank you," and moved on, Modek's light combing over the melted heaps and ruin. They passed wall after wall, stepping over their remains that slumped like cooling wax. She smirked, Modek at her shoulder. "Once these were the terror of my sisters. I sent them here to encamp until they found the doors. When they didn't return, I assumed them dead." She gestured around with her long snout. "But now you've made the claustrophobic maze into a field." He chuckled. "I cannot do that often, grandmother. It takes a considerable portion of my strength. I fear I must rest for some days before my flames can move freely like that again." "Then your sacrifice is all the more appreciated." She looked around, hissing low in her throat. "How do you think they died, my sisters?" He sighed, watching a charred corpse of some outer beast as they passed. "There were creatures ensnared here alongside your sisters. Perhaps they were fallen upon by their like." "Yes, the old ones, my bastard children. There were few who survived my death and weren't corrupted by the rot." She snarled, the world, her world, flashing behind her eyes from the sockets of a corpse skull swimming in a writhing mass of her own carcass, rotting, bursting, stinking under the ether. "I remember well," Modek said with disgust. "There were thousands of beasts. We thought they were of your flesh, but when the first of our cousins came forth and told us it had corrupted them..." He flicked to her and cleared his throat. "Speak, grandson. There are miles yet, and the silence is unsettling." "Well, it shocked me. We'd met the shades in your forms and the beasts. We thought they were different members of the same kin, but when Usher and Narration told us of the plague..." He swallowed, the flame brightening in his hand until it crackled, light washing over the field of molten slag, shadows like stripes behind the waxen stumps of the labyrinthine husk. "It disturbed us, even me, to think we could become as they, devoured by your hatred." "It was stronger then," she said. "Now, I don't think even the corpse of my old body could taint gods. Perhaps Adamar, but nothing so powerful as us." "You wane?" She smirked, eyes flicking to the floor as she stepped over a high stump of wall and sighed. "I've searched for the Banes for so long, even more when I heard they were sealing themselves forever. My sisters and I tried for eons. The firstborn are all but dead. We generals much the same, and the rest of them little more than servants to we few who remain. Yes, I've diminished." She looked up, white eyes blazing as heat glowed beneath her scales. "But after today, I'll reunite with all my sisters and their beasts. We'll claim the world and make it anew." "You won't reclaim your old form?" She looked at him, and for a moment the light in his eyes dimmed. "No. That form is dead and has been for too long. I'm remade as I am now. But then I shall repopulate the chaos with these forms." She smirked and bounded forward on all fours like a cat, shouting over her shoulder, "Perhaps I'll stop making these pesky children of mine." Modek watched her, expressionless before he looked back to the distant light of the gateway, and bounded forward, long legs carrying him like a stag. Temat stood from 4 legs, shrinking to the height of a man as Modek slowed beside her, looking down and smirking as electricity flashed at the corners of his eyes. I forgot how small he made the Adama to afford them this door. "Hurry! Things haven't gone awry thus far, and it concerns me." She walked through the square hole in the dark stone as Modek shrank, the satchel now covering his back as he followed. "Fret not. The distraction of the unruly dead will be the cause for that." They came into the hall, rising again to tower over man. The Gavoshka Dematique stood like a frozen ray of the sun, doors white as bone and shifting, silver shields fixed to taunt her with the memory of her murder, and the 3 locks like dozens of rings set within one another. She faced Modek and opened her hand. "Give them to me that I might fix them." He furrowed his brow, opening the bag and unrolling the waxen scroll. "They don't each open the locks. They must all open each together." She picked up Aru's knife, then Eradu's, and held the edges of their blades together. "Grandson, weld these with your touch." He pinched the blades, fingers glowing white and yellow as they sparked along their edge. He pulled away, leaving them joined as Temat blew and the iron turned black. They repeated it with the last dagger, bending the blades until they nearly sat flush, and the handles curved like the toes of a bird. She held it up by the point and tapped her index claw against Aru's white gem, cracking it and drawing greenish-white ichor down the handle and along the blade. Then copper-orange ichor from Eradu's, and gold from Earu's, until they mingled and ran together in an aura. She inclined her head and turned, reaching into her mouth and carving the roof with a grunt. Black ichor trickled down her fangs and covered her free hand before she set it where the 3 blades were joined, letting ichor flow and mingle with one another. It settled along the length, the 4 colors swirling together, mixing themselves until it was like wet clay. "The funniest part about this prison is they needed my blood to open it," she chuckled. "With all of me on one side and all of them on the other, neither party should ever hope to open the banes, and thanks to the strength of my petrified flesh, they were the only entrance. So I thank you again, grandson, for letting a few of us inside before the doors were finally shut. Now the world is ended, and we shall build a new one on the backs of those who stood against us, who persecuted us, ridiculed us, murdered us." She smiled wide as she approached the lowest lock, kneeling before it and sliding the blades through the vertical slit. The rings jumped and whirred, spinning around one another as tumblers danced within the mechanism of Gavoshk Adematik. The images of the golden shields wailed, pleading for her to stop and leave the bane shut, weeping, screaming at her, mourning as the wheels turned and stopped. The wails stopped. The tumblers stopped. What happened?" Modek said, stepping back. "Did it unlock?" "No." She furrowed her brow. bloody hand on the golden rings as white eyes glided over the glyphs. The dialect ancient and almost forgotten, changed now even in the mouths of the gods. No! She focused on one word, snarling, pulling the blades free and throwing them aside with bared fangs. No! She beat her fists into the door, growing to a giant and pounding, eyes finding the word in the uppermost lock, too. Adam. Her lips peeled back. She screamed, vomiting a column of fire as her claws grated against the white and gold, tail whipping and slamming into the black stone. She stepped back, fire dead and door unharmed, as she stared at the 3 locks and the shields watching her. Now do you understand? She turned and snarled as the air coalesced into light and shadow, wrapping into the shape of a man, a winged god, Aarok. She hissed, "What do you want, whore's son?" She flicked to the little door, and the air was empty. Your companion seems to have abandoned you. Pity. He would have faced a lesser punishment had he confessed to me. Aarok crossed his arms, black wings rustling as his golden eyes flared with anger despite his stony face. Don't fret. Modek will be found. This is their final insult. An Adam? No Adam has ever seen these lands whilst living. Eridu's memory flashed in the back of her mind, the firstborn shade bleeding into the Adamah as he watched, giddy from the storeroom. She closed her eyes and hissed, roaring as she punched the bane with a thundering thud. From the beginning, in the very foundations of the world, Eru laid a law kept secret even from my mother and father, especially from Modek. Aarok turned and found her gaze as she looked over her shoulder. It was made by the king, by the Lord of Order, in a world founded in order by the Orders 3. There are none who can break it, even them. I am chaos. I am subject to none of order. You are. She turned and grabbed his throat, drying blood staining the sapphire tunic. I made order. Her teeth kissed his cheek as he stared into her eyes, unmoved and unreadable as stone. Order comes where it pleases, and when there is naught but chaos, from where else should it have sprung? He set his hand on her throat. I'd rather not kill one of the few left who can answer for these crimes. Please, let us not fight, Temat. She snarled and cast her hand down, picking up the blades. I am not of this world, so I am not bound by it. Fantasy may release you from dread, but truth does not leave the room because you shut your eyes. It will be there when you look away from delusion, and nothing will have changed. Be silent, child! Smoke billowed on her words. He spread his wings, and the wind pushed her back. His body glittered like polished marble, eyes alight like sunrise and sunset, wind bellowing off him as he rose above her, voice like thunder. The world was made in order, and whilst you are in this domain, you shall abide by their law. Of your will or no. You are no authority over me, boy. She rose, smoke crawling from her throat. He grabbed her mouth in one hand, the other grabbing her wrist as she went to claw him, a third appearing from his back to grab her other. It is the law which says the Orders 3 founded and crafted this world and their offspring and kin after them. But the law doesn't say it is theirs. It was made not for them, but by them. He leaned forward, skin shining like the moon, hair drinking the light like his mother's. They delighted in the works of their hands and the growth of their children and make, but they discovered they built it not for themselves. They built it for the Adamah. He pushed her back, sending her across the room, sprawling over the floor as he flapped his wings and shrank to stand eye to eye with her. And so they gave the ultimate choice to them, to man, with the blood of the mother of chaos and father of order, the blood of the mother of vengeance and father of justice. It was given to them the right to decide the fate of the world. The Locks must drink the blood of all four of you, yes, but not from their veins. It must be the blood of the Adam who wields the key, the willing, the one uninfluenced by any of us. He smiled. But in truth, your key wouldn't have worked anyway. The power of the blood of the serpent is spent in you, as in all shades. The last true drops of her blood are in the veins of the Adamah. She stood and spat. Her blood is my blood! You lie to yourself, for you cannot face the truth. He smiled sadly. All things end which begin, one day even me, and the serpent is dead and gone. You are her shadow, the echoes of her voice, the memory of her age refusing to die. I am she! Boiling tears rolled over her scales as she balled her fists. You are not. You admitted it yourself to Modek, that you have diminished. Perhaps once you were she, but now the power is waning and you will cease, until all that remains of her is your memory, and whatever else of your sisters lie beyond the Banes. In hopes of destroying the works of her children, you sought to corrupt the first Adam, but in so doing, you used the last of her pure blood to make the wardens of your own prison instead of opening it. Her evil was subdued, yet again, by her final 3 offspring. Her fingers tightened around the blade until the metal bent and her black ichor dripped to the polished black floor. She snarled and wailed, casting the daggers at Aerok. He took the twisted, melted metal and stared at her, expressionless as the blades clanked to the floor. Powerful as you are, Temat, you are not a goddess. You're a shade. Her lips quivered, tears flowing as she half turned and leaned against the wall, claws gouging it as she hissed. You are a reflection, she growled, heat boiling under her scales, of a memory. She stared at the wall, muscles twitching as she snarled and craned her neck. Of the shadow of a corpse. She bounded forward, body stretching in the air, head growing as horns broke her skin, muscle and bone shredding and reforming, entrails falling and slithering back inside as she arched through the air, coiling on herself as a serpent. Aerok took wing and launched above her, grabbing her horn and tossing her back as Eru had done so long ago. She crashed to the floor, writhing, hissing, tail whipping at him with stinger thirsty to taste him. He grabbed it with his other hand, foot on her throat, and broke off the end of her tail. She screamed, black ichor spraying over her body and pooling on the floor. He leaned over her, ignoring her tears, face like stone as he hefted her head up so she could look into his blazing eyes. A corpse that will never speak again, forever rotting beyond the sight of gods or men. I'm the eternal serpent, she gurgled, tail lashing as he pressed harder into her throat. I will never die. He nodded, a small smile cracking his face. You and the rotting serpent beyond those doors will always be, in one form or another. He pulled her closer, squeezing her horn and cracking the bone. She gasped and wriggled, trying to buck her head away. But, he continued, you will never again act without the will of the Adamah. With all their power, even those who forged the foundation and wrought the law are subject to it. So, little shadow, who are you to think that you could break it?